Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Good evening. Welcome to the World Over Live. Attorney and former law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, Wendy Long is here to talk about the U.S. Supreme Court nominee Elena Kagan. What kind of justice might she make? And later, Bill Burleigh, retired chairman of the EW Scripps Company and original member of the USCCB's National Review Board for the Protection of Children and Young People, joins us to talk about the sex abuse crisis, the Pope's strong statement from Portugal this week, and the way the media has covered the story. If you have questions or comments, call us tonight at 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. and internationally 205-271-2980, or drop us an email, worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get down to business. Here's the brief news from the world over this week. Two major statements coming from Pope Benedict XVI during his apostolic visit to Portugal. On Tuesday, Pope Benedict made his strongest statement yet on the clerical sex abuse scandal. Speaking with reporters during his flight to Portugal, the Pope called the scandal truly terrifying. He acknowledged attacks from the media and others, but said the biggest persecution of the Church doesn't come from enemies on the outside, but is born out of sin within the Church. The Holy Father further called for profound purification and penance, as well as pardon and justice. More about the clerical sex abuse scandal and Pope Benedict's comments in our next segment. And in Fatima on Thursday, Pope Benedict said that abortion and same-sex marriage are some of the most insidious and dangerous threats facing the world today. Speaking to Catholic social and healthcare workers, he saluted initiatives protecting the essential and primary values of life, beginning at conception and of the family based on an indissoluble marriage between a man and a woman. The comment drew a rapturous and extended applause from the Portuguese faithful in attendance. The Holy Father concluded his trip in the city of Porto on Friday. Back in the U.S., pro-life advocates are criticizing President Barack Obama's pick for the Supreme Court. Several groups have pointed to Elena Kagan's history of abortion advocacy as cause for concern. Questions have also been raised surrounding her positions on marriage, the role of religion in public life, and how big a role the government should have in limiting speech and gun rights. If confirmed by the Senate, Kagan will be the first justice since the 1970s to join the Supreme Court without ever serving as a judge. More about Kagan's nomination later in the program. And their numbers are dwindling. Another pro-life Democrat who supported President Obama's health care overhaul will not serve in the next Congress. On Tuesday, Representative Alan Molohan of West Virginia was defeated in the Democratic primary by pro-life state senator Mike Oliverio. Molohan was part of the so-called Stupak coalition that agreed to vote for the health care bill in exchange for an executive order that purportedly restricted abortion funding. There he is standing behind the president when he signed the executive order. The vote likely cost him his seat. Pro-life groups had since targeted Molohan for defeat in the primary election. In recent weeks, Democratic Congressman Bart Stupak and David Obey of Wisconsin announced that they would not seek another term on Capitol Hill. Both faced tough re-election battles in November. And Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has had a change of heart. After years of contradicting the U.S. bishops on abortion and months of ignoring them on President Obama's health care plan, here's what she had to say about the bishops this past week on the latest hot-button issue, immigration.
I would hope that there's one thing that we can do working together as we go forward that speaks to what the Bible tells us about the dignity and worth of every person. and that is on the subject of immigration. The cardinals, the archbishops, the bishops come to me and say, we want you to pass immigration reform, and I said, but I want you to speak about it from the pulpit. I want you to...
One bishop who has spoken out on the issue is the Cardinal Archbishop of Los Angeles, Roger Mahoney. But he's gotten into a little bit of hot water over his recent comments. Jewish rights groups are outraged by the comparison Mahoney made between Arizona's recently passed immigration enforcement law and Nazi Germany policies. Rabbi Marvin Heyer, dean of the Wiesenthal Center, said Holocaust survivors are upset about the exaggeration and that it's harmful to them when they know that their mothers and fathers were taken to the gas chambers without any recourse to the law, end quote. Cardinal Mahoney's Nazi comments were echoed by the LA City Council members on Wednesday as they voted to suspend millions of dollars worth of city contracts with Arizona-based companies. Cardinal Mahoney has not apologized for the remark, nor has he pulled down his blog posting where the comment first appeared. And in Boston, a controversy is brewing after a lesbian couple's 8-year-old boy who had his admission rescinded from an archdiocesan school. According to reports, on Monday, the pastor of St. Paul Elementary in Hingham, told the lesbian couple that the child could not be enrolled in the school. The couple said that their relationship, being in discord with church teachings, was the reason cited by the pastor. However, on Thursday, the superintendent for Boston Archdiocesan Schools, Mary Grassa O'Neill, offered to help the lesbian couple find a different Catholic school for the boy. O'Neill said the Archdiocese does not prohibit children of same-sex parents from attending Catholic schools. Cardinal Archbishop Sean O'Malley has been in Portugal all week, but a spokesman said he was aware of the matter. Earlier this year, you'll remember that the Archdiocese of Denver stood by one of its pastors who decided to refuse school admission to the child of the gay couple. And just 2 weeks after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled it could stay on national park grounds, the Mojave Desert Memorial Cross was stolen. The 7-foot-high cross, first built to honor veterans who died in World War I, had stood above California's high desert for 76 years. The cross survived several court rulings which called for its removal. But on Sunday, or early Monday, thieves cut the metal bolts that attach the cross to a rock in the desert preserve. Authorities still have no leads, other than it may have been taken by a disgruntled atheist who apparently doesn't care for the judicial system. Veterans groups have offered a $25,000 reward for the perpetrator's capture. And finally this week, outraged Catholic League President Bill Donahue has started a worldwide petition after the Empire State Building rejected a request to commemorate the life of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. For years now, the Empire State Building has changed the color on its upper tiers to mark special occasions. Donahue submitted a request to light the Empire State Building blue and white in honor of Mother Teresa on her 100th birthday later this year. The U.S. Postal Service is already marking the day by issuing a stamp in her honor. The Empire State rejected the request without comment. Donahue pointed out that those who run the Empire State Building had no problems commemorating animal rights, gay pride, and even the wondrous 60th anniversary of Communist China. That's right, for 2 days last year, the Empire State Building was aglow red and gold. But for whatever reason, Mother Teresa doesn't meet their standards. For more information, you can visit CatholicLeague.org. When we return, we'll discuss the Elena Kagans Supreme Court nomination with Wendy Long. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there. Military as a whole. Does that get at the difficulty here?
Well, it really doesn't, and that's why I say, in the last few days, the straw man has been raised that, oh, she's not anti-military. Well, no one really said she's anti-military, but what she did is incontrovertible. She denied access to military recruiters in a time of war at a great institution whose men and women have shed blood for our country and died for it ever since the American Revolution. And that is no small thing. So that to say she's not anti-military is not really the point. She's taken other positions, for example, saying that terrorists deserve constitutional rights. She's written things comparing the United States to a dictatorship for denying such rights to terrorists. And so I think you have to look at the total package, of which this piece of kicking the military out of the Harvard Law campus recruiting program is not an insignificant part. You know, Scott Brown obviously is a Massachusetts senator. You know, he's a kind of middle-of-the-road Republican. I don't think he's somebody who necessarily would be quite as sensitive to the whole range of culture war issues and some of the legal issues that are in the background. But you have to keep in mind, he is also her home state senator. And so for that reason, he may be trying to say some nice things about her. I'm not sure.
Wendy, if you read the New York Times and believe the New York Times, they had a piece about a week ago claiming that Elena Kagan forged a middle ground approach on this. She was trying to find a moderate position, and though she said the military couldn't be in their offices, use the offices on campus to recruit, they were certainly allowed on campus. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really inaccurate. It is not a fair characterization. The only access that students had to the military as an employer, this is Harvard Law students, was via a student organization, a student veterans organization, which was provided an email address that students could email. Now, to anybody who's ever done job recruiting on any campus, doesn't have to be law school, you know that when a school endorses an employer, it sets up a process. You know, they have a jobs office, they have all the information in booklets about the various employers, they have a schedule, they give rooms to these employers to come and set up, and they have a whole schedule of interviewing students. And you know, they bring them water and snacks, and they set out a place to have lunch, and it's part of an endorsed official school process. It's very different if the employer is completely excluded from that process and all you're given is an email and you say, well, you've got access if you want it, just send an email and see if you can talk to them and get an interview. It's really, really not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I want to move forward to, it's sort of related. Elena Kagan's sexual orientation has become an issue in recent days. Friends of hers coming out and saying, wait, she's straight. I remember she dated men in law school. There have been suggestions in the press that she's a lesbian. Is this germane to the discussion of whether she's fit to be a Supreme Court justice or not?
Well, Raymond, you know, it shouldn't be germane. What's amazing, the thing that's most amazing to me about this is the double standard, that all these people who are now screaming, this is completely irrelevant and it's unfair to ask, these are the same voices who were saying things like, you know, we must know whether Clarence Thomas told this or that joke, and we must know what the receipts in Robert Bork's trash can said about what movies he rented from Blockbuster. And this is coming from the same crowd, Senator Chuck Schumer, for example, who said that it was of great interest to him that William Pryor was a devout Catholic, and that he felt that because he had those deeply held beliefs, he was unfit to serve as a judge. And this is all the same crowd who's now saying this is completely irrelevant. You know, putting aside that double standard, I do think that the only relevant consideration is whether somebody can faithfully apply the Constitution and the laws and the Bill of Rights impartially to all groups and all individuals, and put aside their personal ideology and their personal agenda. That's the only question that we ought to be able to ask, and that's the central question, frankly the central question about Elena Kagan.
But when you have issues like gay marriage, that will no doubt come before this Supreme Court in short order, a contested issue like that, the don't ask, don't tell policy, which is also seems to be in the pipeline, these issues will be decided by, presumably, Elena Kagan if she gets the approval of the Senate. So, I mean, in the same way that they quizzed and grilled Catholic justices when they were being confirmed about their positions relative to Roe v. Wade, do you expect to see that same sort of attention being given to Elena Kagan's possible sexuality? We're not sure where it lies here.
Well, I don't think she's going to get the same kind of grilling about anything, Raymond. I think that, you know, I think there's definitely a double standard operating, and I think that, you know, the pressure of sort of the liberal intelligentsia and the mainstream media, you know, is such that I think many senators are going to be afraid to press her on a whole variety of subjects. And frankly, she's pretty deft at avoiding answering questions, as we saw in her whole Solicitor General confirmation hearing. You know, it's incredibly ironic because she once wrote in a law review article that Senate confirmation hearings for judges that don't really explore in depth what their view of the law is and don't answer really meaty, substantive questions, she called them a vacuity and a farce. And I don't think I'm going out on a limb to predict that that's exactly what her hearings are going to be.
We're getting an email. This is from Luis in Puerto Rico watching. He says, what is Kagan's record on the abortion issue? Do we know?
Well, we do know, for example, that she has made personal monetary contributions to a pro-abortion organization. We know that she has supported only pro-abortion candidates for president, you know, Michael Dukakis, Barack Obama. You know, we know that she was close friends with Barack Obama back at the University of Chicago, where they surely discussed their views of the Constitution and constitutional law, including certainly the abortion issue. And remember, her soulmate, Barack Obama, is a man who, as a constitutional law professor and then a state legislator in Illinois, voted against laws banning infanticide of babies already born, babies already outside the womb. And the reason he did so was because he was afraid that banning infanticide would undermine the legal underpinnings of Roe v. Wade. He was so concerned about keeping every theoretical basis for Roe v. Wade intact as a legal argument that he voted against these infanticide laws. And these are, again, these are two people who share the same view of the Constitution. You know, if you look at everyone she's worked for, she was a research assistant for Larry Tribe, who's advanced legal arguments in court about abortion being about the subjugation of women by men and comparing abortion to involuntary servitude under the 13th Amendment. So she has been associated with and has worked with many people whose views of abortion are consistent with what one would expect hers are, having worked with so many people like that. But of course, she's never sat as a judge, and we don't have any of her independent writings on the subject.
Wendy, Elena Kagan, the pick, President Obama's pick for the Supreme Court vacancy, met this week with Amy Klobuchar, the Democrat senator. And coming out of that meeting, Klobuchar said she sees Elena Kagan as an intellectual counterweight to Judge Roberts. Do you think that's an accurate description of what she could be on the court?
I think it is accurate in a sense, Raymond, and here's the reason why. She is very bright. There's no denying that. In an academic sense, she's very quick. She has a bright mind. You know, she was very known as being very bright in the Clinton White House. There's a story going around that Rahm Emanuel used to say every day. He'd walk into the White House and say, "Hurry up, Elena had better come up with some policy." Which also goes to, you know, the fact that she's kind of a policymaker. But back to your question, I think she is sort of an intellectual heavyweight, you know, not to say a judicial heavyweight since she's never done any judging, but I think she's also she's very powerful. I mean, she's been very charming. She's charmed a lot of conservatives. So I think she can be quite persuasive in her personal relationship. So I think that in that sense, she could prove to you know, mold opinions when the justices sit around, the 9 of them among themselves in chambers talking about cases. I think in that type of academic discussion, she could have a lot of sway over other opinions. So in that sense. But I think what's really interesting is, you know, she's kind of the antithesis of John Roberts. And I've been thinking about this a lot just in the last few days because one of the criteria historically for a judge, at least in our American system, has been humility. And we saw that in John Roberts. We saw it in Sam Alito. We've seen it in Clarence Thomas. You know, we've seen that humility is a very important characteristic for a judge. And I think she is the antithesis of that. You know, we saw that in her testimony when she was up for Solicitor General. She said, you know, I'm a famously excellent teacher. When Senator Coburn asked her, you know, gee, you don't have any judicial experience, you don't have any legal lawyer litigation experience, what qualifies you? And she said, well, I have outstanding judgment. You can ask anybody, and I'm a famously excellent teacher, which sort of caused the senators to chuckle, but that's the attitude that she seems to have taken about a lot of things, including, frankly, pushing the whole don't ask, don't tell position and saying it's a moral injustice of the first order. And just she sort of thinks that her own moral and ethical pronouncements are kind of the last word on things. And that's the antithesis of what Chief Justice Roberts is, and I think it's a very bad thing for an American judge.
Wendy, final question. What is your best guess on how this will turn out? Do you think she'll get confirmed?
Well, I think sadly, Raymond, I think it's likely that she will be confirmed. You know, there were 31, I think, votes against her for Solicitor General. I hope there will be more votes against her now, because I think some people, some Republicans may have voted to allow her, voted yes for Solicitor General, thinking, well, the president gets to pick his own cabinet and his own executive branch, and we'll defer to him for that. But when you come to an independent position on the Supreme Court, I'm in hopes that more senators will exercise independent judgment and vote no on her, and we'll explain the reasons why, so that this can be an educational teaching moment for the country. But unfortunately, you know, this is what Barack Obama said he was going to pick, and this is what he's given us: somebody who will have empathy for certain groups, as he calls it, who will tilt the law to favor certain groups, is really the opposite of impartiality. And I hope that as many senators as possible will stand up for impartiality and say no to this nomination. But I do think that given the current array in Congress, I mean, it would be fortunate if this nomination were to happen later. Maybe if Republicans could take back control of Congress, this nomination couldn't get through. But I think in the next few months, it's likely that it probably will.
Very good. Wendy Long, thanks so much for joining us, and we will check in with you as this process moves forward throughout the summer.
It's Raymond.
Thank you. When we return, former member of the U.S. Bishops National Review Board, newspaperman Bill Burleigh joins us to talk about the sex abuse crisis and the way it is covered in the media. Don't go away. The World Over Live continues in a moment.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
My next guest spent nearly 60 years in the newspaper business as a reporter, an editor, president, and CEO. He recently retired as chairman of E.W. Scripps Company and was an original member of the U.S. Bishops National Review Board. That was the lay group that oversaw the implementation of policies to protect children and young people in the church and investigated this entire crisis. With his experience as a journalist and his time spent dealing with the sex abuse crisis in this country, we wanted him to reflect on the latest accusations around the world and in the media. Please welcome back to the World Over Live, Bill Burleigh. Bill, thanks for being here.
Good to be back.
Great to see you again. Let's start with your impression of the various voices we're hearing coming out of the Vatican from separate offices and various officials. They don't seem to be reading from the same hymnal, if you will. What do you make of this communication strategy?
Well, I wonder if there is a communication strategy. Some of these remarks are bizarre.
Yeah.
Thank goodness the Pope is saying what he is saying.
Right, and I want to get into that because there was a lot of crosstalk for weeks, and that became the story. This cardinal saying that, this archbishop saying petty gossip, and then there was folk trying to talk about it's the media creating it, and we had Cardinal Aveda do the press
taking on
rounds.
the New York Times.
The New York Times was the reason. Was that wise to wag a finger at the media?
No. Well, we've always learned that you don't fight the person who buys ink by the barrel.
Not a good policy. I want to share this with you. This is a clip of the Pope on the plane from Rome to Portugal early this week. Here's what he said. He's speaking in Italian, so I'll provide the translation. And then, Bill, I'd like you to react to this. He says, attacks against the Pope and the Church do not come from outside, but from internally, in the church, from the sins that exist in the church. I see this as truly terrifying. The biggest persecution of the church doesn't come from enemies outside, but is born out of the sins of the church. There is a very great need that it must do penitence for our sins and accept purification to seek forgiveness as well as justice. What do you make of that comment by the Pope?
Raymond, you're probably too young to remember Walt Kelly's wonderful comic strip, Pogo,
Yes.
and that famous panel where Pogo has a magnifying glass looking at his navel and says, "We have met the enemy and he is us." I don't mean to be irreverent, but the Pope's remarks reminded me of that.
Yeah.
We indeed are the place where we need to look. And yes, I think the media has misfired, has attempted to make him a scapegoat. But certainly, I think the Pope has taken a major step in creating the kind of transparency and credibility that this most recent crisis that has grown worldwide deserves.
Has this turned the narrative, though? Did this statement change the narrative here, or is this just a blip? Look, he apologized to the Irish people not long ago and wrote a beautiful, and I thought, very bold and clear declarative statement of where the church is on this. And to my eye, that seemed to be groundbreaking. It was reported on a Saturday, it went away by Sunday. Will this statement meet a similar fate?
I hope not, but I'm afraid it will, because obviously there are people covering this story and commenting on this story whose minds had long been made up. I once had a professor at Marquette, the great Father Virgil Bloom, who said there is an latent anti-Catholicism in the American mind and it's never going away. I debated him often on that question, but now, 50 years later, I think he's right.
Really? What do you make of the New York Times and other outlets reporting of this issue? Did the media drive this recent spate of sex abuse coverage, or did the story lead the way? Did events lead the way, in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, a reporter always needs a source, and I smell the plaintiff's lawyers leaking things to the press to gain an advantage in some litigation that is now nearing a very critical stage, litigation that seeks to envelop the Vatican in U.S. civil action.
Right. People don't realize, in your home state of Kentucky, in the coming week here, we are reaching a pivotal moment where the Vatican, or their representative, what's his name, Jeffrey Lena, will be making the argument that the Vatican indeed did not suggest that the bishops suppress reporting these cases to authorities, but were allowed to do so under canon law. But this is a critical moment. If this case moves forward, we're talking about a lot of discovery. And I believe at that point, as Bob Bennett suggested a few weeks ago on this program, you could see major revelations coming out. What do you think that would look like?
But it transcends far beyond that. Can one sovereign state involve another sovereign state in litigation? This case is headed for the Supreme Court, I'm virtually certain.
But we've seen this repeatedly. The Vatican has tried to make the argument that they are a sovereign state, and these lower courts have all said, sorry, you can stand trial here. That's a stunning development.
It sure is.
So we'll see what happens.
And it's something to worry about.
Yeah.
I do think, though, Raymond, that it's a danger to try to demonize the press. And you need to understand that reporters are doing their job. They're not the editorialists. They're not the ones calling the Pope bad names. They are simply gaining the facts. Some of these reporters were condemned for some of their earlier work on the Catholic sexual abuse crisis, and they've been proven right. And I think in the long term, they've been helpful in bringing the facts out that we might not otherwise have ever learned.
No, certainly in the Boston case and in the spate of sex abuse that you investigated and looked into, none of that would have become manifest or entered the public discussion, or I dare say have been addressed in the way it has been, had it not been for the media scrutiny.
And truth be told, I think it nudged the Catholic bishops into doing their 2002 great work in creating the program that is now almost 10 years old, that has made the Catholic Church in the United States maybe the safest place in the world for children.
You believe that now?
I do.
After looking closely at these cases?
I do. You know, in this past year, there have been more than 5 million Catholic children who have received counseling on being careful about sexual abuse if they're accosted. And something like 2 million people have teachers, priests, teachers, deacons, grade school soccer coaches have all undergone criminal background checks, all in this huge effort to safeguard the children.
The one blind spot critics will charge of the policy put forward by the bishops in their charter, and we see it again and again in the press even this week, where you have Cardinal Schönborn pointing to another cardinal and saying he blocked an investigation that then Cardinal Ratzinger wanted to move forward with. One senses this internal struggle, not on the low level between priests, but between bishops. There is no accountability for bishops in the American charter. Was that an oversight? Is that something that needs correction or should have been given more thought, do you think?
Well, those of us who were involved in it at the beginning thought it was a huge gap. But there were forces, I assume, within the Bishops' Conference that didn't want to apply the rules to themselves.
And what do you think should be the responsibility of the bishops? What did your report say? I remember the report that you all issued. That was, we haven't seen for quite some time. In what, 8 years, 9 years? What did your report suggest the bishops do regarding their own behavior and holding themselves accountable?
Well, apply the rules that they were applying to the priests to themselves. I ran across, we must learn from history. And the Catholic Church has a wonderful and somewhat not so wonderful history. I ran across this quote from Trent, the bishops from the Council of Trent, countering the Protestant Revolution, said in this one sentence, "Before the tribunal of God's mercy, we, the shepherds, should make ourselves responsible for all the evils now burdening the flock of Christ." Now, wouldn't it be great if today's flock of bishops would adopt that attitude?
Well, and I think there seems to be a movement, not only in the United States, but around the world, that this question needs more scrutiny, because the buck really doesn't stop with the Pope. It stops with the bishop in the local community. Yes. What do you make of this notion, and we've been seeing it in the press a great deal, that somehow the Pope is the great overlord, he's the sheriff of the Catholic Church Universal, and that somehow he should be swooping in the middle of these cases and removing people from ministry or visiting with victims? Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the people who say that don't understand the ecclesial structure of the church. The bishop being in charge of his diocese. Yes, the Pope is the primary bishop, but he is a bishop. And there are a lot of other bishops.
Yeah, that have to be accountable fraternally and to themselves and their flock. Let's talk for a moment about, go ahead.
Well, I recalled a phrase that was used often back then. We need more fraternal correction. Some bishops were calling for fraternal correction of their fellow bishops. We haven't seen evidence of that. Perhaps it took place in the corridors of the bishops' meeting. But certainly that's the sort of attitude that we need.
Well, the Pope called for it this week, and it basically received no reportage. But also during this trip, he mentioned that fraternal correction was needed. So he may have been reading your report, Bill, and I know he probably did.
He doesn't need to read our report.
Well, but let's talk about that conversation you had with him in 2004. You, Justice Ann Burke, and Bob Bennett go and visit the Vatican to try to share your findings and to sound them out, feel them out on the crisis that was unfolding in the United States. What sort of reception did you receive from the officials there in the Vatican?
Well, we were assigned as part of the original National Review Board to investigate the crisis in the United States and to come up with some recommendations. We conducted almost 100 exhaustive interviews with all the players, with victims, and that's a very important part of this. But we were stymied. We didn't feel that we were really getting to the bottom of things. We couldn't get an appointment with the papal nuncio, so in our innocence, we said, let's go to Rome. We discovered later that that was not a very diplomatic thing to do. We met with a number of cardinals. We called them and said, can we stop by and see you? Mm-hmm. And they all said, you must see Cardinal Ratzinger, who at that point was in charge of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, and we learned had been assigned the primary point man in Rome on the American clerical abuse crisis, which at that time we heard whispered was an English-speaking problem.
Oh, really?
We now know that it was not confined to the English-speaking world. Cardinal Ratzinger was on a trip. He was not available. So in our innocence, we sent a fax saying, we'll come back if you will see us. Thanks to some intervention by some friends in that office, we were assigned a half-hour appointment in which we were to be able to convey our concerns. Mm-hmm. That half hour turned into 2.5 hours with a wonderful, holy listener. He told us that he didn't know some of the things that he thought we knew, and he wanted to listen. And for 2.5 hours, he listened, and he made careful notes. He thanked us. We were apologetic. We said, we're not here to upset the Holy Roman Church, mm-hmm. but out of our concern and love for the Church, we want to tell you what we have found. After the meeting was, and he certainly was not the Poncer Cardinal that public opinion had at that time. Mm-hmm. It was obvious he was a gentle, holy, highly intelligent man. As the meeting concluded, some of his aides told us that they had never seen this before, where at the conclusion of a meeting he said, we are going to do the following things. Usually he just said, thank you for coming.
Right.
And the areas that he said were going to be approached turned out to be true. I don't know about the cause and effect, but certainly the things that we brought to his attention, led by the need for apostolic visitation in the American seminaries, happened, and they happened with some teeth in them, and we've seen the results of that.
Yeah, things are a lot better in the seminary, on the seminary front. You and I were talking about this before the show. That part of it actually looks good. That scene, the seminary scene, because of the attention that this whole sex abuse crisis brought to it, yes?
Well, I certainly am no expert of all seminaries. However, I do serve as a trustee of the Josephinum Pontifical Seminary, which is the only pontifical seminary in the United States. It has reworked its curriculum so that in addition to intellectual and spiritual formation, they now have a strong component in human formation, where the young men, they talk to them about celibacy and psychosexual maturity and all of the things that need to be talked about in an open way. And that's very encouraging.
And there's a very good piece in the Washington Post today on Mount St. Mary's, and you see their numbers flourishing. So in the midst of this crisis, you are seeing men going to the priesthood and healthy vocations coming through. I want to go to the phones. Kathy from New York, you have a question. What's your question, Kathy?
Yes, I'm wondering, do they still maintain the no tolerance policy?
Who decides whether this zero tolerance policy will be invoked, or is it a blanket zero tolerance for any offender?
In the United States, the bishops have adopted that as a policy. There are those who think that it's too strong. There are other parts of the church throughout the world that do not have that policy. But I think the American bishops were determined to be completely credible in their attack on predatory priests. And it may be too harsh in the light of day, but I don't think so. I think it was necessary at the time. Nick Caffarty, former dean of the Duquesne Law School and a canon lawyer, was a member of our board, and he wrote a book before Dallas, before the Charter for the Protection of Young People was adopted, in which he said canon law gave the bishops before 2002 all the tools they need to discipline and marginalize priests who were found to be predators. Instead, many of these people, as you know, were moved off to clinics, and the psychiatrist said they were cured, and we now know that was a phase of psychiatry that didn't work.
Yeah. Bill, before I let you go, and we're almost out of time, the report that you all provided to the bishops and to the entire church, we haven't seen much of it in recent days. What do you think is the glaring thing that the church needs to take note of that was in that report as far as the causes of the crisis that we're seeing all over the world?
Well, it starts with transparency, and that gets back to the bizarre communications policy of the Vatican. Our church is suffering, and it wounds all of us to see the church we love suffer this way. And we need to restore its credibility, and this can only be done with transparency. And then you go down the laundry list. We need the seminaries strengthened. We need the victims, their problems to be addressed. I've met with these victims, and we don't hear enough about the horrors that have been inflicted on their entire lives. People my age who continue to suffer from incidents that happened during their childhood. Yeah. And if only the priests and bishops of this world, of this church, would know this, I think the approach would be a much more vigorous, aggressive attack on the problem.
Very good. Bill Burleigh, thank you for being here, and thank you for all you do and have done. Thank you. That is all the time we have until next week. You can find updates and the occasional commentary by following me on Twitter at twitter.com/Raymond Arroyo, or you can join my Facebook fan page. I think I'm the only person who's not a member of that page. And I'm always at RaymondArroyo.com. The Prayers and Personal Devotions of Mother Angelica is still in bookstores everywhere, online, and available from the EWTN Religious Catalog. Until next time, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.